Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 60 of the Feeling Good podcast. And
where are we broadcasting from today?
I don't know, from somewhere on a cloud.
The Murrieta Studios.
That's right, the Murrieta Studios, yes. Actually, we have a couple of mini announcements today. I haven't reminded you, David, but today, actually tomorrow to be exact, will be the 1-year anniversary of our publishing this podcast on iTunes.
No kidding, I had no idea.
So we'll have to...
put her there.
Yeah, give me 5.
That's great. And I'm going to... another neat thing about tomorrow is I'm going to be giving a talk at Stanford from 8 to 10 a.m. When you hear this, it's too late to attend. This will be
it'll be
Monday.
Published a couple of days later, yeah.
But I'm very excited about it. It'll be a talk kind of for the general public and for Stanford individuals who are interested. There'll probably be some therapists there.
I think you said there was their wellness consortium.
Yeah. And it'll be the Lika Chin Center, kind of feeling good talk, introduction to CBT and also the new team therapy. But I'm excited about it because it occurred to me the other night that I first appeared at Stanford as a medical student in 1965.
Yeah.
And as you know, for the last 20 years or more, I've been on the voluntary faculty there, and I put in...
And you've been leading the Tuesday group, and now there's a
Thursday group for psychiatric residents, and I've been putting in, thousands of hours of time in volunteer work and teaching these seminars that I give. But this is the first time I've ever been asked to speak at Stanford in over 50 years.
It's kind of amazing.
Well, it was kind of a shock to the system, but I'm kind of a slow learner, I guess. But I'm glad, hope I'm going to try to do a great job, and I'm
well, of course
very
you will.
excited about it.
That there's no question there, but I just cannot believe that in all these years they haven't asked you to do a presentation.
Yeah.
Maybe they felt like your Tuesday group was enough of a venue, but I don't know.
Well, it could be, but at any rate, I'm grateful to have the experience and pretty excited about it too. Mm-hmm. And then also some upcoming stuff that people do have time to consider. Oh, we have to talk about our new outreach too that we just set up.
We'll talk about this in a moment.
In a second, but in the middle of next month, in the middle of November 2017, I'll be presenting with Jill Levitt, a clinical psychologist who I teach with at Stanford. We're going to give a 3-day workshop.
And staff at the Feeling Good Institute.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to give a 3-hour workshop on When Helping Doesn't Help at the ABCT convention in San Diego.
Yeah.
And that'll be on overcoming therapeutic resistance.
Yeah.
And we're also going to give a 6-hour workshop on building a better CBT and talk about the evolution of traditional cognitive therapy to this new team therapy. So if any of you are thinking about going down to San Diego in the middle of November, we'd love to see you at one of those presentations. And then at the end of next month, I'll be up in Calgary, Canada, and also Medicine Hat.
At the end of November 2017.
Yeah, right. And I'll be giving 3 presentations at Jack Hiroshi and Associates Trauma Conference, including, I think it'll be a free evening one for the general public on skills, not pills for depression.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's neat. And then
tools, not school, skills, not pills.
Right.
Yeah, I love it.
And then the next day, I'll have a 1-day workshop in Medicine Hat, which is not too far from Calgary, on scared stiff, fast, effective treatments for anxiety disorders. And then one other thing, in the middle of December, this massive Evolution of Psychotherapy conference is coming up in Anaheim, and that's a huge event. Thousands of people attend. They have all kinds of big name people there presenting, the top names in the field. And that will be in Anaheim, and I'm honored to be giving 5 presentations. I believe there are some, just hour long, and also I'll be doing a 3-hour workshop and a little 2-hour presentation on fast cures for panic disorder and stuff like that. So those are some things to keep in mind if you're looking for CE credits or want to attend hear me in person.
So not to bore our listeners with the following details, but we're both kind of excited about our new platform. And people may not know this, but I'm a bit of a technology geek. Psychology is a second career for me, and I used to
third career. First was pilot.
That was very brief, but.
Well, up until the crash, you were doing well.
Exactly, yes. After that, I had to retool. How about that? But we migrated our podcast media to a platform called Libsyn, and now we can finally tell how many people download our episodes and where from, and this is really exciting. So, based on that, I want to give a shout out to our one listener in Myanmar. Whoever.
No, we have 2 in Myanmar.
No, I think that was 2 downloads, but one listener.
One listener. Yeah.
I see. Shout out to that person, whoever that is. We're very happy to have you listening to us. And we'll keep an eye on the growth of our audience in Myanmar.
Yeah, that's right. And also this new Libsyn thing, Neil Satin, who has a podcast on relationships, he was and I did his once, and I'm going to do his again. Yeah. And he's a fantastic guy, and he's the one who turned us on to this. And we'll also, I saw Fabrice's fabulous technical skills this morning. We just set it up on all kinds of additional platforms. Now it'll be coming through on YouTube.
Yes, well. That's really interesting because, you can listen to our podcast now. You can go to David's Facebook page. You can go to David's Twitter account, and you can go to his channel on YouTube. So there's a number of ways. As well as
my website.
Of course, the website. Yeah, that's always been true.
Yeah. And then one other thing I want to announce is I have a new radio show. It's kind of a radio show. And that's Sundays.
A live feed on Sundays on Facebook.
On my Facebook page. I think that comes in on I can't remember if it's my personal or my public Facebook page, one or the other.
So if it's your personal, that means they need to friend you?
Maybe. I'm not sure.
I don't know. We'll have to figure that out.
Yeah. But at any rate, it's a Q&A, and it's either a half an hour, depending on how many questions they are. But I've done it, I think, 2 weeks in a row, something like that, and it's gone surprisingly well. So if you're interested, that's West Coast time, California time, 2:30 p.m. on Sundays. I won't be doing it this Sunday though, because I'm flying to the East Coast for workshops on relationships, and it's all your fault workshop.
It's not my fault. All right,
never our fault. It's always someone else's fault.
Exactly. All right, on to our topic for today, and we've been moving away for a while from techniques, and I know that people are kind of interested in learning new techniques, and you have this list of what you call 50 ways to untwist your thinking. Those are like your core cognitive techniques, and you selected today to talk about one called self-monitoring.
Right.
And that's a really interesting one. I think isn't it based like on the Thorndike effect or one of those effects? I can't even remember.
It could be. I don't know what the Thorndike effect is. I've heard of it, but what is the Thorndike effect?
Well, when you know that somebody is going to check up on you or watching you, your behavior changes.
Oh, so we're on better behavior because we're on podcast type of thing.
Exactly. If that's an example, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So
sure.
you stop dropping curse words when you have a microphone in front of you.
Yeah, or perhaps you should. I don't always remember to follow that rule.
So, but anyways, you want to tell us about self-monitoring?
Well, it was one of the earliest cognitive therapy techniques, and it kind of ties in with mindfulness meditation in a funny way. But I'll tell you what I think are the strengths and perhaps the weaknesses of this approach. And I have two really exciting vignettes too that bring this technique to life. But the idea behind it was very simple. Was that when you're depressed, you have a lot of negative thoughts, and we've talked about this extensively on the podcast. Like Tuesday night in the group, I did live work with one of the participants who let us use her name, Rhonda, and she had been teaching, and got some feedback after her teaching. That on a feedback forum like the ones we always use, she got all upset and started, thinking that, she was screwed up and, she shouldn't have made whatever mistakes she made, and that people would be judging her, and I'm no good, and I'm a nobody, and all I can do is care for people, like I have no leadership skill, whatever. I don't have the exact number, but all these thoughts were going through her mind, and she believed them 85-90%, and she'd had a couple of weeks of intense negative feelings, similar maybe to ones you've had at times. I know they're similar to ones I've frequently had, feeling anxious and ashamed and kind of angry and inadequate and worthless and inferior, and helped her turn those thoughts around. And it was just a blow-away session. It was just so warm. She brought so much to the table, and we all just kind of got euphoric at the end. And maybe we'll try to publish that with her permission if the audio was good enough as a podcast. But the bottom line is we have these negative thoughts that cause us to feel horrible. And the whole thing of cognitive therapy was how to help people get rid of those thoughts. When you're anxious, you have the same thing. You have these negative thoughts coming into your mind that make you anxious. And a very common example of that probably a lot of listeners can identify with is when you get symptoms of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Like you might put a letter in the mailbox and then you start telling yourself, oh, what if it didn't go down? Or, what if this and what if that? And then you go back, you start checking, you're looking in there over and over again. And so we developed all of these techniques to help individuals somehow crush these negative thoughts, get rid of these negative thoughts. And one of the techniques was just called self-monitoring. And the way it started out was that we told patients to wear a rubber band around their wrist. And that whenever you have that negative thought, instead of dwelling on it and getting all upset, you just tell yourself, well, that's a negative thought, and you snap that rubber band on your wrist.
Sounds like negative reinforcement.
Yeah, that type of thing, and then just let go of it and go on with your life. And then it went to a slightly more sophisticated level that I told patients to get a wrist clicker, like what golfers use to keep track of their score. And there's two kinds. One you wear on your waist, and one it's just like it. They used to cost $10. They probably still cost about that. You wear it on your wrist. It's just like a plastic band and then a dial. And each time you click the dial, the number goes up one. And so then I would tell people to count your negative thoughts during the day. And then at the end of the day, you can put the number on your calendar or keep track of it, a written record, and reset it to zero. And then I would tell patients to count your negative thoughts all day long. Then when you have a negative thought, again, instead of dwelling on it, just click it and then go on with whatever you were doing. And so you might have like 90 negative thoughts at the end of the day, and you put down 90 and set it back to zero. And I told patients, agree to do this for at least 4 weeks, because usually doesn't work until the fourth week for some reason. And then what some people find is suddenly in the fourth week, the negative thoughts start going down, and then disappear, and then the person is symptom free. Well, the good thing about it, it's a very simple technique. The bad thing about it is it almost never helped anybody. It rarely was effective in my experience, but occasionally it was.
What was the principle behind it? Why the drop after the fourth week?
You know, I think I'd have to say my answer to most questions. I don't really know. One way to think about it. I mean, it might be what you were saying, the Hawthorne effect, but that's not an explanation. That's just a description of what happens. You know, I'm not much of a meditator. I know you are, and millions of people are so gung-ho now on meditation. But I think what little I know about meditation is that you're sitting, you're focusing your mind and on this one thing, could be your breathing or the word Om or, you know, whatever it happens to be. And then you find that your mind will drift off. And then instead of attending to what your mind is drifting off to, you just note that and then gently bring it back.
Yeah.
And so this could be viewed as meditation in daily life.
Yeah.
That your life becomes your meditation.
Right, okay.
But then we have these interrupting thoughts, like right now I'm having fun interacting with you. And so this brings us into the here and now. And the here and now can be a pretty phenomenal experience, but then we'll get distracted and think, oh, I have to speak at the Li Ka-Chen Center at Stanford tomorrow. What if I screw up? And then I'll get all anxious, and that distracts me from the current moment. So you could think of it on that basis. But I'll give you a couple of examples. But then
that'd be interesting. Yeah.
Maybe you can speculate and have some ideas about how it works. One person who it was very helpful to was an eye doctor who came to me, and his work he was an ophthalmologist, was to give people eye examinations all day long. You know, see if they needed surgery or glasses, or, you know, if their eyes were in good health. He was a single man. He lived with his mother. He was a little bit of a lonely individual, but all day long, you know, he would have this thought that upset him when he was checking people's eyes. And I don't know if you've ever had a floater in your eye, Fabrice. You see like some...
Yeah, when I pay attention, I see them, you know.
Yeah, and it's natural. Most people see like this little dot going across your visual field. And
I play with that sometimes. I can see if I can make it move the way I want, you know.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly. And but occasionally, in rare occasions, people with diabetes, it can become a sign of retinal detachment requiring laser surgery.
Yeah.
Well, this fellow would see a floater, and he didn't have diabetes. There was nothing wrong with his retinas. But he would then have the thought, what if I'm going blind?
Yeah.
And this thought would cause anxiety. This is very typical of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And then he would give himself an eye examination between patients. He'd squeeze one in, and so typically during a day he'd give himself 10 or 12 eye examinations between scheduled patients.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And he was just consumed with this negative thought. And then weekends, he would binge on it. He would go to his office and just spend 15 hours giving himself eye exams over and over again. He would give himself an exam. Oh, everything's fine. He'd check something out. I don't know how he's checking his own eyes, but he, vision tests, and then he would feel good. But then he would think, but he'd see another floater, and he would say, well, maybe this one is retinal detachment.
Yeah.
And it was very sad and pathetic, and all he was doing with his life was just giving himself...
Seems really all-consuming.
Yeah, as OCD can sometimes be, like with Howard Hughes, who, locked himself into a room at the top of some hotel in Las Vegas and taped all the cracks and everything because he was so afraid of contamination. It's almost like a form of mental cancer when it becomes very severe. And this fellow was almost at that level. And so I used...
Oh, I can see a floater right now.
Yeah, well, you might be going blind.
I might, yeah.
So I used a number of techniques that weren't helpful. I do a recovery circle, and in the middle I put the thought I might be going blind,
Yeah.
and then there's arrows coming out of
Yeah.
the recovery circle, and each arrow points to identify the distortions and empathy and agenda setting and double standard technique and examine the evidence and things like that. And these techniques weren't helpful. And then I came to self-monitoring and also the technique called response prevention.
Right.
And so what I told him is what I wanted him to do is for 4 weeks to wear this wrist counter on his wrist. And every time he had the thought, I might be going blind, when he had a soft loader and told himself, gosh, what if I'm going blind, to click it on his wrist. So the number would go up by 1, and then let go of the thought and get back to what he was doing. And I told him in addition, he had to agree not to give himself any eye examinations at all during this 4-week period of time. And I explained to him initially this would make him very anxious because he's giving up something he's addicted to. Giving himself an eye test reduced his anxiety, and so that improvement in his anxiety became addictive. That's
of course,
how
yes.
OCD works. So I told him, once you don't give in to that impulse for the first few days, you'll get more intensely anxious, but if you just keep refusing to give in to the compulsion to check your eyes, eventually that compulsion will go away. So he agreed to do this, and the first few days, I think he had 70 thoughts that he was going blind on day 1, and then like 85 on day 2, and went up to 96 on day 3 because he got better and better at noticing.
And noticing them, because he probably has had a lot more than that. He just didn't notice them,
Yeah. And then they plateaued between 80 and 100 for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And then in the third week, one day it went down suddenly it was 51, and the next day was 28, the next day was 12, the next day was 4, and the next day was 1, and the next day was 0. And at that point he was pretty much cured of obsessive compulsive disorder.
Yeah.
So that was one person for whom this approach was very effective. Now, a colleague from UCLA, and his name went out of my mind, he wrote a book on OCD. Mm-hmm. He was the guy who did the visual imaging, showed that cognitive therapy over 12 weeks could cause changes in brain patterns.
I mean, like the what do you call it?
MRI, functional MRI.
Okay, I see.
That I'm trying to think of his name, but I thought maybe you would remember his.
No.
Oh well, at any rate, he wrote some book on OCD, and this was, I believe, the only technique in his book.
Okay.
But he had a different name for it, and you can also view it as reattribution. He just told his OCD patients, when you have these obsessive thoughts, like I better check the mail, or I better check the stove, or the house will burn down, just reinterpret the thought and tell yourself, oh, that's just my OCD,
right?
And then drop it and move on to something else. So that's the same technique. The only difference here is I use 50 or 100 techniques because this one often doesn't work.
Right.
And we've got tons of other huge, powerful methods for treating all forms of anxiety, including OCD. But this was a patient for whom it just happened to do the trick.
And one thing to point out is that even a particular technique that, in your experience, sometimes, often doesn't work. Well, the times when it does work is very important to have it available, but because for some people that may be just the ticket.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, another thing about these techniques that I've developed or learned or refined is that I don't think of them as techniques. I think of them as metaphors for how people change their lives. So instead of 50 techniques, you have 50 metaphors.
I'm not sure I'm following you.
You can just think of self-monitoring not as clicking things with your wrist, but as a concept that by tracking things it can be a way to change your life. And I'll give you another example of how it changed somebody's life, but it was done in a radically different way. And the reason I'm saying this is to loosen up our listeners' creative thinking, because once you learn one of these techniques and see it working for someone, then you can often think of many other creative ways to use it. So it's still categorized as self-monitoring, but the details and the context, it becomes radically different. So here's another example of self-monitoring that was surprisingly effective for someone. In Philadelphia, I was supervising a clinical psychologist, PhD, very bright, very lovely woman, who raised the question during the supervision, if depression is really due to some chemical imbalance in the brain or some problem in the brain, how could cognitive therapy help?
Yes, a fair question.
Yeah, and I said, well, tell me more why you're asking that important question. She said, well, I'm treating a man who's a carpenter, and he had a stroke, and the expression of his stroke is what's called pseudobulbar palsy.
Okay.
And strokes can cause it. You can see it in a variety of other disorders of the central nervous system where there's actual brain damage. But in his case, it was caused by thousands of microscopic hemorrhages in the deep structures of the brain.
Yeah.
And what pseudobulbar palsy is, and it's been getting a lot of attention recently in medical email CE programs and things like that, is because there's two symptoms. One is uncontrollable sobbing and one is uncontrollable laughing. And so this is a form of depression that's actually caused, we know with 100% certainty, by brain damage, actual tissue damage.
Yeah.
And so what happens is if there's the slightest little sad thing that happens, the person will start sobbing uncontrollably. And then if the just minor little funny thing happens, they start laughing uncontrollably.
Yeah.
And she said, so how could I use, cognitive therapy to help this patient of mine whose depression is actually caused by hemorrhages, brain tissue damage? And I said, well, always, we don't treat problems, we don't treat diagnoses, we don't treat disorders, we treat human beings. And I would love to supervise you in his treatment, but we need an agenda. We want a specific moment when he was upset, where this was causing problems for him, and maybe even fill out a daily mood log. What was the event? What were the emotions? What were the negative thoughts? The same playbook that we always use in treating anyone who's depressed or anxious. So she came back to the next week's supervision session, and the upsetting event for him was playing poker with friends. Mm-hmm. And apparently he was retired, and the thing he'd always loved most in life was getting together with his buddies and playing poker. And he had all of these intense negative feelings, shame and frustration and anger and anxiety and inadequacy. And apparently what was happening was that when he would get a really good hand, he'd start laughing uncontrollably.
That's not very good.
And then when he'd get a bad hand, he'd start sobbing uncontrollably.
I don't know if you would call that a tell. It's more like a shout.
Yeah. So he was having a lot of trouble playing poker, and he was also, ashamed and embarrassed, and he wasn't doing very well.
He must not have been winning much.
No. And so his negative thought was, I just can't control my feelings, my emotions. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, let's look at the distortions. And again, it's all or nothing thinking, black or white thinking. And I said the issue here is it's not that he can't control his emotions at all, but he can't control his emotions as much as usual. And so what we could do as a technique, we could tell him to buy a stopwatch and keep it in his pocket and keep a little journal so he can take notes. And every time he has the sudden urge to start crying or laughing, reach in his pocket and turn on the stopwatch. And then try, although he can't control his emotions completely, see if he could postpone the crying and laughing for maybe 1 second or 3 seconds, or maybe he could work his way up to 5 seconds. So he could, instead of thinking about his emotions in an all or nothing way, he could think about in shades of gray, and it also could become like an athletic challenge to see if he could increase the number of seconds. So each time, then once he cries and laughs, he clicks the stopwatch again and then records what day of the week, what time of day, and how long he deferred the emotional outburst. Well, this appealed to him because he had been a track star in high school, and so he knew very well what it was to get in shape, to improve your time through repeated, effort and running and, improving your data. So the technique also helped him, perhaps on the cognitive level, by changing the way he was thinking about this crying, instead of like an all or nothing defeat as an athletic challenge, something he could work at and get better at. And so the first week he was able to defer initially just for a few seconds, and then he had one episode where he got it up to 15 seconds, and he was very, very excited about that. And by the end of the second week, he was able, then in the beginning of the second week, then he got to where he could defer 30 seconds and 45 seconds, and then he got
get better at it.
A minute. And then by the end of the second week, he could defer his emotional outbursts indefinitely. And of course, his depression disappeared at that point. So that was another example of self-monitoring. And then another, and we can talk about that in a second, but one other thing I wanted to mention is that we also do self-monitoring in our podcasts, so that we want to get the data. How many downloads are we getting, and find out.
It's feedback in a way.
Quantitative feedback in order to improve your life. And also, then I plugged this into how we do team therapy in a big way, because we now have patients measure their symptoms, the severity of depression, anxiety, and anger, and other feelings, if you want, at the start and end of every therapy session. And the therapist looks at it at the end of the session and can see how much he or she has improved in every single session with every single patient. And that data, that self-monitoring, that quantitative feedback is what has led to these amazing breakthroughs that we now call team therapy, where, at least in my own practice, I can often see a complete elimination of symptoms in a single therapy session because I'm measuring and keeping track. Whereas early in my career, when I didn't do this, I just did it once a week, it was better than nothing. But now we have really refined self-assessment tests for therapists, and it can dramatically transform your practice. So I now think of it as something that can be tremendously beneficial for patients and for therapists, and that crossover with meditation might be of interest to listeners who are focused on and excited about meditation.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that feedback loops are a natural process. We have feedback loops in the universe at all levels. Yeah. And so it makes sense to add this to our human created processes so that they get better over time.
Absolutely. Is there a parallel? I mean, you meditate with meditation, or am I off on the limb there?
Well, I'd say meditation is a little bit different, but I'm thinking about more, natural processes, like, when I get sick, then I try to, stay in bed and don't do as much until I get better. My body tells me, don't overexert yourself. When when I haven't eaten, my body says you're hungry. And so and the feedback is I get food. All those things are natural processes, and they allow us to function.
And then how does self-monitoring fit into that framework?
So self-monitoring is you intentionally creating feedback for yourself. So you're creating the feedback that by noticing what it is that you're doing, what it is that you're thinking.
Right.
And as you do this, you have a reaction to the feedback, which makes you, at some level, change your process. And you see the change in your process by the next loop of self-monitoring.
So the feedback, the quantitative feedback, can change the way we think, feel, and behave.
Yeah.
If we're open to that.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, I wanted to ask you, have you published your list of 50 ways anywhere besides your ebook?
Well, in my book, When Panic Attacks, there's 40 of them, the ones that have to do with anxiety disorders.
Okay.
And when I publish my new book, Feeling Great, I'll probably have all 50 of them. Thanks for that suggestion. I hadn't thought of that, but yes, I'll
what
put
I'm wondering
them in
is
there.
if you could maybe publish the list on your website or maybe even in this podcast show notes, and people can look at the list and see which ones they're interested in hearing more about.
Well, definitely, at the very least, put the one-page list of the techniques, the 50 techniques, and then people, that's a great idea, can call in and say, well, hey, you haven't done this technique, you haven't done that, because we need to be nudged a little bit.
I know. Well, we're doing our own ship here, driving our own ship, and so...
Right. We get some self-monitoring.
We need the feedback from our listeners to tell us what they want to hear.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it was great to hang out with you at the Murrieta Studios this morning. And I hope
on the cloud.
we hope that people enjoyed this.
All right. Thanks, David. Talk to you next time. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.